My name is Emily Turner, and I was 29 years old when my father died. He passed away on a rainy Thursday morning in late October, the kind of gray, bone-deep chill that made even memories feel colder. We hadn't spoken in nearly 6 months, not out of anger, but because life simply got in the way. He was busy running the family business, and I had just started a new job in a different city. That silence would now echo through me forever. I had planned to visit him the following weekend. I had even bought his favorite tea. But life, as it tends to, doesn't wait for our apologies or intentions. It just moves forward, often without mercy. Have you ever been silenced by your own family? Told that your feelings, your voice, your truth didn't belong at the table simply because it made others uncomfortable? If so, drop a comment below. Your story deserves to be heard. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. When I arrived back in my hometown of Ashford, the grief in the air was almost tangible. People walked slowly, spoke softly, and looked at me with that mixture of sympathy and distance that comes when you're the daughter of someone important. My father, Alan Turner, was more than a parent. He was the respected founder of Turner & Sons Civil Engineering, a quiet yet powerful man who held the town's respect like a badge. But to me, he was just Dad, the man who showed me how to build tree houses and draw blueprints before bedtime. The man who always said I was born with a voice too sharp for a quiet world. The funeral arrangements had already been made by my older brother, Andrew. He was the firstborn, the golden child, the heir to everything. Andrew and I had always been distant. He believed in order, silence, and the hierarchy of family. I, on the other hand, believed in truth. In honesty. In saying what needed to be said. Which, as I learned quickly, wasn't something my family wanted. Especially not now. When I walked into the family's living room the night before the funeral, dressed in all black and carrying a copy of the eulogy I'd written, Andrew looked up with that same tired disdain he always reserved for me. "You're not speaking tomorrow," he said, not as a question, but as a decree. I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" I was planning to share a few words about Dad. "I wrote something." "No, Emily," my mother said from the armchair, her voice brittle. "Andrew's already arranged the speakers. It's a small service. Intimate. We don't want to make it emotional. As if emotion was a crime. As if grief was something to be tucked behind silk gloves and floral arrangements." "But I'm his daughter," I replied, my voice already beginning to shake. "I should be allowed to speak at my own father's funeral." Andrew folded his arms. "This isn't about you, Emily. You'll cause a scene. Dad would have wanted it dignified." I almost laughed at that. My father had always said, "Speak even if your voice trembles." And yet here they were, trying to silence me in the name of false dignity. I looked around the room, but no one stood up for me. Not my mother. Not my aunt. Not even my cousin Laura, who I'd once confided everything in. They had all accepted this pretense of composure over truth. That night, I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, reading my speech over and over. It wasn't angry. It wasn't controversial. It was just a daughter's goodbye, a few memories, a thank you, a final farewell. But the fact that I was being denied the chance to say it lit a fire in my chest. Why was grief only valid when it came from the mouths of men in suits? Why were women told to cry quietly, to sit prettily, to mourn in the corners while someone else took the mic? The next morning, I stood outside the church doors in a black dress that felt more like a costume than clothing. Everything about this day felt rehearsed, staged like a production my family had written without my input. The guests were already filing inside. Business associates in charcoal suits, old neighbors with weathered faces, former employees nodding respectfully. They murmured to each other in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward me, then away. I could feel their curiosity like a pulse in the air. "She's the daughter, right?" I heard one woman whisper behind me. "Strange she's not listed in the program." And just like that, the reality of my exclusion was made public. My name wasn't anywhere. Not on the back page. Not in the acknowledgements. Not beside Andrew's name under "survived by." I sat in the second row, one seat behind the front pew reserved for immediate family. My mother didn't even glance back. Andrew sat like a statue beside her, straight-backed and stern-faced. There was no invitation for me to move closer. The service began with a hymn that my father hated and a prayer he never recited. A pastor who had never met him spoke generic words about integrity, dedication, legacy. as if reading them off a script emailed an hour before. I clenched my fists in my lap, holding back the storm in my chest. Then Andrew stood. Of course he did. He approached the lectern with the confidence of someone who had always assumed he belonged there. He spoke eloquently, delivering a polished speech that hit all the right marks. His love for Dad, the company he built, the family values he upheld. But to me, it all sounded hollow. Mechanical. Like it had been designed to earn him sympathy points rather than offer genuine grief. There was no mention of Dad's terrible jokes, or the way he hummed to himself while making tea, or how he once taught me how to patch a tire during a rainstorm just because he believed I should know. It was a eulogy built for reputation, not remembrance. When Andrew finished, he gave a polite nod and returned to his seat as the pastor thanked him. And that concludes the family reflections, the pastor announced. That was my breaking point. I stood up, involuntarily. My legs moved before my brain caught up. The entire church turned their eyes toward me. Some widened in surprise. Others narrowed in judgment. But I couldn't let it go. Not without a fight. I'd like to say a few words, I said, my voice louder than I intended. I'm his daughter too. Andrew shot me a look so sharp it could have cut glass. My mother looked down at her lap, refusing to meet my eyes. The pastor, caught off guard, stammered awkwardly. I'm sorry, miss, but the family provided a speaker list and left me off it, I interrupted. But that doesn't mean my grief is any less valid. Before he could respond, Andrew rose again. Emily, this isn't the time, he said through clenched teeth, trying to keep his voice measured. You're embarrassing yourself. I felt the heat of humiliation creeping up my neck, but I stood my ground. No, I replied. You're embarrassed that someone's grief doesn't look like yours. That someone has feelings you can't control or predict. But I won't sit in silence just because it makes you more comfortable. A stunned silence fell over the church. I turned toward the pastor, hoping for a sliver of human empathy. But he looked at Andrew, then at my mother and simply said, Perhaps we can continue the service. There's a reception afterwards. I could have screamed. Instead, I walked out. I walked straight down the aisle, past all the polite strangers and the uncomfortable family friends, past the same people who used to hand me biscuits at summer parties in our garden. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. My hands were shaking. I felt like I had failed to honor my father, failed to speak, failed to be heard. Again. But I didn't know then that the story wasn't over. That my father had left behind one final decision. A small act of truth that would shift everything. That afternoon, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by relics of a simpler time. Old photographs, my debate team medals, a dusty model of a bridge I'd built with Dad in year 9. I was staring at the ceiling when my phone buzzed. It was an email from his lawyer, Judith Howell. The subject line read, Reading of the will, tomorrow, 9 a.m. I hadn't even known there was going to be one so soon. The next morning, I walked into Howell & Partners' law office unsure of what to expect. The room was small, filled with dark wood and heavy curtains. Andrew was already seated. He didn't look at me when I entered. My mother sat beside him, looking tired. Judith, my father's longtime attorney, greeted us with the professional warmth of someone who'd seen too many families unravel in this very room. She began reading through the will, and for the most part, it went exactly as I'd expected. Formalities, bequests, estate breakdowns. Then she paused. There is one more component. A recorded message, included at Mr. Turner's specific request. Andrew shifted in his seat. A message? He asked, frowning. Judith simply nodded and pressed a button on a small black recorder on the table. My heart stopped. And then I heard it. My father's voice. Hi, Emily, he began. And if Andrew and your mum are hearing this too, then good. I want them to. I'm sorry this couldn't be done in person, but you know me, always hated the dramatic entrances. Still, I couldn't leave without giving you the words they wouldn't let you say. My breath caught. Judith glanced at me with a flicker of something. Sympathy? Respect. Your words matter, Dad's voice continued. And if they won't let you speak at my funeral, then I will speak for you. Everything you wrote in that letter. I read it. Every word. And I want the people who were at my service to hear it too. Then, unbelievably, the audio shifted, and my eulogy began to play. My voice, recorded in Dad's voice, word for word. My eyes burned with tears. My brother went pale. My mother's lips parted in stunned silence. The soft amber sunlight filtered through the cathedral-style windows of the local community church, casting long shadows across the pews that had once seated our entire family in quiet, reverent order. Now, those same seats bore unfamiliar guests and polite nods from people who only knew pieces of my father's legacy. As I sat off to the side, carefully removed from the rest of my family, I watched my brother Ethan take the podium for a second time that week. He had already spoken at the wake and again at the family dinner, seizing every opportunity to be the voice of mourning in our father's absence. The man who had spent his life demanding silence from others now had his memory narrated solely by the son who mirrored his most authoritative qualities. But this chapter isn't about Ethan. It's about me, about what changed. The evening after the funeral was when the turning point truly began. A man named Malcolm Hargrove, my father's estate attorney, had called me directly. A surprise in itself given how thoroughly I had been excluded from every official communication up until then. "Miss Walker," he began politely, his voice aged but alert, "your father requested a private reading of his will tomorrow morning. Only you are invited. 10 sharp. My office." He hung up before I could ask why. The next morning, I arrived 10 minutes early. Malcolm's office was tucked inside a quiet historical building in the center of town, filled with leather-bound books, heavy drapery, and the faint scent of old paper and sandalwood. He greeted me with a nod, gesturing to the high-back leather chair across from his desk. After offering me tea, Earl Grey, black, just how I liked it, he opened a slim folder with the seal of his practice pressed into the corner. "Your father left an addendum to his will," Malcolm said calmly, as though he had said it 1,000 times. "It's not legally binding in terms of assets, but it contains final instructions. One's meant for you, and you alone. He also left behind a recorded message. Would you like to hear it?" The words, recorded message, hit me like a shot. I wasn't sure whether to brace myself for cruelty or closure, but I nodded anyway. He pressed play. My father's voice crackled through the speakers. "Charlotte," he said, and hearing my name in his voice was both jarring and comforting. "If you're hearing this, it means I followed through on my promise, to let you speak when I no longer could. I've made a lot of mistakes, but not giving you a voice in this family was the worst of them. That's why I've made arrangements for your words to be heard at my funeral, even if they tried to stop you." The room spun for a moment. I sat back, stunned, my fingers gripping the armrest. Malcolm cleared his throat. "He left a flash drive," he said, sliding a small device across the table. "It contains your recorded eulogy. He had you recorded 3 months ago, remember? When you visited him in the hospital." I nodded slowly. That visit had been strange. He'd asked me to sit and speak about our memories, to tell him the story of my childhood in my own words. I had thought he was being sentimental, perhaps trying to relive the past. But now I saw it for what it truly was. My father making space for me at last, when he knew he wouldn't live to defend me. "He instructed me to deliver this to the funeral director," Malcolm continued, "but I was overruled by your brother and mother. So instead, I followed his backup plan. The audio will play automatically during the post-ceremony reception this afternoon. You should be there." My heart thundered. He wanted my voice heard, publicly, powerfully, and had made sure that no one, not even Ethan, could erase it this time. The reception was being held at the community center downtown, an elegant hall filled with photos, floral arrangements, and catered food. I arrived just before 2 o'clock, wearing the same black dress from the funeral but walking with a different kind of weight, one of responsibility. I didn't mingle. I didn't make eye contact. I simply waited. At exactly 2:15, a microphone popped to life. The room grew quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," a staff member announced, "the family has asked to share a brief recording prepared in advance by Mr. Daniel Walker. Please direct your attention to the screen." I watched my mother's head snap toward the front of the room. Ethan stood up, confused, mouthing words to someone near the podium. And then, my voice. "Good afternoon," it began. "My name is Charlotte Walker, and I'm the daughter of Daniel Walker. I know many of you didn't hear from me today at the service, and I'd like to share a few words that my father asked me to record before he passed." The shock in the room was palpable. You could feel the pause in everyone's breath as I, through that recording, began telling my story. I spoke about my father's quiet warmth in moments no one saw. I talked about the times he secretly left encouraging notes in my schoolbooks, even though he couldn't say those words aloud. I reminded the audience that being silent didn't mean being weak, and that sometimes, the people who are kept furthest from the spotlight carry the deepest truths. I saw eyes begin to water. People listened. They really listened. Ethan looked like someone had pulled the rug from beneath him. My mother had gone pale. And yet, no one dared interrupt. They couldn't. My father had made sure of it. When the recording ended, the room was silent again. Then a slow, unexpected ripple of applause began. Someone from his old workplace. Then a neighbor. Then another. Within seconds, the room stood clapping. Not out of obligation, but from recognition. I had finally spoken. And it mattered. That moment changed everything. My voice was no longer something they could ignore. And more importantly, I no longer needed anyone's permission to use it. But what would you have done in my place? Would you have played that recording, knowing the backlash it might spark? Or would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear what you think. And if this story resonates with you, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We share real, powerful stories like this every week. And your support means the world. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the chapel, casting colorful reflections on the marble floor as Eleanor sat in the back pew, still reeling from the aftermath of the funeral. Her father's voice, clear, unwavering, and alive through the will recording, echoed in her head with painful clarity. She had said nothing aloud in that service, but somehow, through that final message, she had spoken the loudest. And now, the silence that followed had grown heavy with questions, judgments, and ripples of discomfort that reached far beyond her own grief. When she emerged from the chapel an hour later, she was not met with warmth or curiosity from her relatives, but with the tight-lipped stares and hesitant glances of those who couldn't quite decide whether to pity her or punish her. Aunt Joan avoided eye contact entirely. Her cousin Richard gave her a stiff nod and walked right past her. Even her mother's face, pale and drawn with exhaustion, was a mask of tension and restraint. But what truly pierced Eleanor's composure was the moment her younger brother Daniel came up to her. His face pale, eyes red-rimmed. "Why didn't you tell me he'd recorded that?" Daniel asked, voice low, sharp with both confusion and pain. "Why did he talk to you and not us?" Eleanor tried to hold his gaze, but the accusation in his eyes was too much. "I didn't know until this morning," she said, her voice firm but not defensive. "The lawyer sent it to me with a time lock. Dad wanted it played today, not before." "But why you?" Daniel snapped. "Why not us? You haven't even been around for the past 3 years." "I wasn't invited," Eleanor replied. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, didn't explain the dozens of unanswered calls and cold shoulders she'd endured since she'd left her father's company. She didn't recount how the very people mourning him now had once sided with him in ostracizing her when she'd refused to take the VP role on his terms. Instead, she stood tall, letting Daniel walk away, leaving a vacuum of unspoken truths behind him. That night, the house was both full and hollow. Full of people who hadn't spoken to her in years, yet walked the halls as if they still owned a place in her story. Hollow because her father, complicated, proud, ruthless, and now suddenly redemptive in death, was gone. The one person who might have made sense of all this chaos could no longer answer for it. Instead, Eleanor was left with a posthumous confession that had cracked open a vault of long-ignored secrets, and she wasn't sure what to do with any of it. In the living room, over glasses of wine and hushed reminiscing, snippets of her father's will played again. This time, whispered among guests who hadn't known the depths of his regrets or the reaches of his affection. One particularly biting comment came from her father's old business partner, Mr. Cranford, a man with a voice like gravel and an ego twice the size of the house. "Well," Cranford muttered to another guest loud enough for Eleanor to hear, "if he really meant all that praise for her, he'd have made her executor. Giving her that final message was just for show." The words stung, not because they were true, but because Eleanor knew how many people were already rewriting the narrative. In their version, she had swooped in, stolen a moment of grief, and manipulated her father's last wishes. The truth, that she had been the only one he'd trusted to carry the message because of their fractured yet honest relationship, wasn't the story anyone wanted to hear. Determined not to let that become the final word, Eleanor excused herself and walked outside into the crisp evening air. The garden behind the house was just as she remembered it. Carefully manicured hedges, white roses in bloom, and the old iron bench beneath the oak tree where she and her father had once talked for hours about philosophy, business, and everything in between. It was there, 3 summers ago, that she'd first told him she couldn't work under him anymore. "You don't listen, Dad," she'd said back then, voice trembling with the weight of years. "You talk, you decide, and then you expect the rest of us to follow like we have no thoughts of our own." And he had said nothing, just looked at her, jaw tight, disappointment in every line of his face. But now she realized that must have been the beginning of his change. Because it wasn't long after that argument that his tone softened during the rare calls they shared. His criticism turned to curiosity, and his pride became laced with something she hadn't expected: humility. Back in the present, as Eleanor sat on that bench again, her phone buzzed with a message from her father's attorney. "Call me tomorrow. There's something else we need to discuss. Your father left a personal addendum. Not included in the formal will." She stared at the screen, her heart thudding. What could he have left unsaid even after that message in the will? That night, she couldn't sleep. The house was quiet now, most of the guests gone, and even her mother had retired upstairs, offering nothing more than a cold glance as Eleanor passed her in the hallway. Lying in the guest bedroom, Eleanor replayed the moment the recording began. The way her father's voice cracked when he said, "I failed my daughter more than anyone else in this room." He had named her. He had taken accountability. But what did it matter if no one else could accept it? By morning, the pressure of that question had crystallized into determination. She would see the lawyer. She would hear that addendum. And then she would decide what to do with the truth her father had entrusted to her. But before we continue, have you ever had someone recognize your worth only when it was too late? How did it change you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear them. And if this story is resonating with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started. The following morning, Eleanor stood at the edge of the city, outside a modest law office nestled between a florist and a bakery. The unassuming exterior was almost ironic considering the weight of what she was about to uncover. The attorney her father had trusted with his final wishes was a seasoned man named Robert Alton, with silver hair, measured eyes, and a voice that spoke in deliberate cadences, as if every word had been examined before spoken. He greeted her with a warm handshake that held no pretense, only a strange sort of quiet reverence. "Thank you for coming, Eleanor," he said, motioning her into the office. The room they entered was old-fashioned in the best way. Bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, a polished mahogany desk, and framed newspaper clippings of Alton's career highlights. Eleanor sat across from him, clutching her coat in her lap like a shield. The quiet hum of the city felt miles away as Alton pulled out a thick manila folder. "Your father left this for you privately," he explained, laying the folder down and sliding it across to her. "It is not a legal document. Not part of the formal estate proceedings. It's personal." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were several handwritten pages in her father's precise, angular script. The sight of it alone sent a fresh wave of emotion through her. But it wasn't just letters. There were photocopies of photographs, schematics, and what appeared to be a draft of a business plan. Alton waited patiently as she scanned the contents. The first page was a letter addressed solely to her. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. You endured what I could not fix in life. I owe you more than just words in front of a room. I owe you transparency. And a choice." Eleanor read each sentence with growing astonishment. Her father had written about the origins of his business, the silent partners he'd never spoken of, and most shockingly, about an old startup concept she had presented to him years ago, a concept he had rejected outright at the time, only to quietly develop through his own resources under a different name. He had stolen it. Or at the very least, built upon it without giving her credit. And now, in this document, he was confessing. "You were right," he wrote. "Your model had value, but I didn't want to admit a 27-year-old with no boardroom experience had seen a solution we hadn't." She put the letter down slowly, the truth unraveling before her like a tightly wound knot snapping open. Her idea, one she'd been so passionate about, hadn't just been dismissed. It had been hidden, co-opted, and brought to life without her. The software product his company launched last year, the one that had doubled their valuation in 6 months, wasn't his alone. Its foundation, its engine, its spark, had come from her. Alton watched her with gentle curiosity, perhaps expecting anger. But what Eleanor felt was beyond rage. It was a kind of relief. She hadn't been crazy all these years. Her instincts, her vision, her contribution had been real. And now, finally, it was documented. "There's more," Alton said, retrieving a separate envelope. "This contains your father's posthumous recommendation to the board of directors. He named you as a candidate to lead the innovation division. Effective immediately." Eleanor blinked, trying to process it. "He recommended me?" "He didn't just recommend you," Alton replied. "He made it clear that his final wish was for the company to move forward under the guidance of the person who first inspired its most successful product line. And he instructed them to give you full voting rights on strategic development decisions." The words sank in slowly. All this time, she'd believed she'd been cast out, blacklisted by her own blood. Now, she was being handed a seat at the table she had once been denied. A seat bought not by forgiveness, but by hard-earned, finally acknowledged merit. "But they'll never agree to it," Eleanor said. "The board, my family, none of them will accept this." Alton opened a side drawer and pulled out a stamped letter addressed from the board's interim chair. "They already have. Unanimously." After the will was played at the funeral, and upon reviewing the enclosed documents, they voted last night. She sat back in her chair, stunned. The magnitude of the moment was staggering. 4 years, she had wondered if her voice mattered, if her contributions had simply evaporated into the egos of others. And now this. A redemption she never dared expect. But with it came a heavier realization. Everything had changed. And nothing could go back to how it was. Later that day, as she walked out of the office with the folder clutched to her chest, Eleanor passed a newspaper stand where a headline caught her eye. "Legacy Rewritten, Visionary Businessman's Daughter Named to Lead Innovation Arm." Beneath it, a photo of her walking out of the funeral, her face partially hidden, her presence finally acknowledged in the public eye. She took a copy, slipped it under her arm, and kept walking. Not out of vanity but out of proof. Proof that a woman who had once been told to sit quietly in the back now had the power to drive the future forward. What would you do if the truth came out after it was almost too late? Could you forgive someone who waited until death to validate you? Let us know in the comments. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. We have so much more to share. By the time Eleanor stepped into her father's old boardroom the next morning, it felt as if she was walking into a different world. The space, once looming and cold, now buzzed with the electricity of a changing tide. Seated around the polished oak table were the same executives who had once dismissed her as merely Alfred Brenton's quiet daughter. But today, they sat upright, alert, reviewing the formal board decision that recognized her new role, Director of Innovation and Strategic Advancement. It wasn't just a courtesy title. It came with voting rights, budget control, and a mandate to lead. As the doors closed behind her, silence fell across the room. Eleanor took her seat, not at the far end near the assistants and legal reps, but directly across from the interim chair, Robert Mendez, the firm's veteran operations chief. His eyes met hers with a mix of reservation and growing respect. For a moment, she simply looked around the room, letting the silence linger. This was no longer the place that had silenced her. This was her proving ground. "Before we begin," Mendez said, "let me officially welcome you, Ms. Brenton. The board has unanimously approved your appointment per Alfred Brenton's final recommendation. We understand you have insights into the recent product developments that stem from your original concepts." Eleanor nodded. "Yes. I've reviewed the architecture of Brenton's Sphere, what you call version 4.2, and I can confirm that the foundational design is based on the adaptive schema model I developed 3 years ago. It was an early proposal I submitted to my father before I left." There was a subtle stir among the board members. Some exchanged glances, others nodded slowly. She knew what they were realizing, that the product they'd praised and profited from had come from the person they'd ignored. "What's more," Eleanor continued, pulling up a flash drive and plugging it into the conference display, "I've created a roadmap for where this technology can go next. We're only scratching the surface of what's possible." A series of slides appeared on screen. She spoke with clarity and command, explaining her vision for expanding the product into predictive behavioral analytics, integrated with adaptive language processing, to serve both corporate and educational sectors. It was forward-thinking, ambitious, and deeply practical. It stunned the room. As she presented, Eleanor's voice grew more assured, not out of pride, but from something deeper, vindication. Each slide felt like a chapter of a story she'd been writing in her head for years, And now she was telling it aloud for the first time. And they were listening. When the presentation ended, silence returned. But this time, it was followed by an unexpected round of soft clapping. From Mendez, then from several others. Even the skeptical finance head, Marcus Trent, leaned forward and said, "This is the most progressive and grounded proposal we've seen in years." But not everyone was pleased. Across the room sat Charles DeWitt, a longtime senior advisor and one of her father's most loyal lieutenants. He cleared his throat, his tone dry. "You have to understand, Eleanor, some of us are still adjusting. It's one thing to approve your role posthumously. It's another to shift the core direction of the company based on legacy notes and emotional inheritance." Eleanor didn't flinch. "This isn't an emotional inheritance, Mr. DeWitt. It's strategic evolution. And the proposal I've submitted is based on tested algorithms and market-ready modeling." He frowned. "It's bold." "Yes," she said, locking eyes with him. "Because staying safe is how companies die quietly." The statement hung in the air like a blade. There were no further objections. As the meeting moved forward, Eleanor found herself speaking more than she had in her entire previous history with the company. She wasn't asking for permission. She was giving direction. And by the end of the 2-hour session, the board had agreed to a pilot expansion of her roadmap with a preliminary budget allocation of $4 million. Walking out of the boardroom, she barely recognized the path her feet took. This wasn't the walk of someone recovering from shame or doubt. This was the stride of someone stepping into her rightful place. She rode the elevator down in silence, but her mind was buzzing. She wasn't doing this for revenge or attention. She was doing this because she belonged here. Her father's will had opened the door, but she had proven herself once inside. Back at her apartment that evening, Eleanor sat by the window overlooking the city skyline. The same skyline her father used to point to and say, "This is what we built, Ellie." It used to hurt, those words, that possessive tone. But now she understood something deeper. He hadn't known how to share credit. Not with her. Not with anyone. But in death, perhaps he had finally found a way to say what he never could while alive. "You were right. You deserved this all along." Her phone buzzed. A message from the company's communications department. "We're releasing a formal statement tomorrow announcing your appointment. Would you like to include a personal quote?" Eleanor stared at the message for a long time, then typed slowly. "Sometimes the voices we silence are the ones we need the most. I look forward to honoring my father's legacy by building a future he would have been proud to be part of, with all voices at the table." She hit send. For the first time in years, her voice hadn't just been heard. It had led. In the days following the board meeting, Eleanor's life shifted from quietly dignified determination to a whirlwind of decisions, calls, and unexpected apologies. Brenton Tech had entered a new era, and at its helm stood the daughter they had once sidelined, no longer as a shadow of her father's legacy, but as its most capable steward. She received messages from board members commending her poise and clarity. A few executives she remembered from her internship days, ones who once barely acknowledged her, now sought meetings to align visions and explore her thinking. It was corporate code for something simple. They knew she had power, and they wanted to be on her side. But Eleanor didn't let the newfound attention cloud her intentions. She remained laser-focused on the rollout of her pilot initiative, an intelligent engagement module integrated into the company's flagship product. It would require collaboration across departments that had rarely spoken before. Instead of sending out mandates, Eleanor invited leads from engineering, user experience, and client services into the planning process. Her quiet, confident style stood in contrast to the commanding tone of her father, and many of the old guard initially saw it as weakness. But results changed that perception quickly. Within 2 weeks, the project had moved from concept to internal demo. Clients who previewed the tool described it as revolutionary and eerily intuitive. Her system didn't just respond to user input. It anticipated user need. One executive from a partner firm asked in disbelief, "You're telling me this system was first prototyped by a junior engineer, yourself, 3 years ago?" "Yes," she said simply, letting the irony settle on its own. At home, Eleanor sat by the same windowsill each evening, sipping tea, reviewing progress metrics and adjusting her schedules. But more than once, she caught herself thinking of her father. Not in anger or resentment anymore, but in curiosity. Would he have applauded her recent victories? Or resented them? Would he have been proud that she carried forward the company's values, or chastised her for not doing it in his way? The answer, she realized, no longer mattered. The point was that she had built something lasting. On her own terms. Then, one Thursday afternoon, she received a calendar invite that surprised her. It was from Charles DeWitt, the same man who had resisted her authority during the boardroom shift. The subject line read, "Lunch?" She hesitated, then accepted. They met at a quiet corner bistro near the office. DeWitt arrived dressed sharply, his demeanor restrained. But there was something new in his eyes. Less condescension, more contemplation. "I'll get right to it," he said after their menus were collected. "I didn't vote for your father's succession plan. I thought naming you was too risky. Too emotional. But I watched that boardroom presentation, and I've seen the weekly updates. You're the real thing." Eleanor blinked, surprised at the directness. "I underestimated you," he continued. "We all did. And that's on us." She nodded slowly. "Thank you. I won't pretend that wasn't hard to hear at first. But I'm here to build forward, not cling to the past." DeWitt leaned forward slightly. "I know you had a complicated relationship with your father. But Alfred respected people who delivered results. He just didn't always know how to say it. The fact that he left you this company, in his final directive. Maybe that was his way." Eleanor didn't reply immediately. The words hung in the air like condensation on glass. Maybe it had been his way. Maybe he'd finally understood what she was capable of, even if he'd never said it in life. Later that day, she visited the company's archive room. A quiet, locked space containing years of meeting records, product blueprints, and personal memos from leadership. She had avoided the room since her father's death, unsure of what she'd find there. Now, with quiet resolve, she unlocked the door. Inside, surrounded by silence and the software of climate control, she sifted through files and digital backups. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Just closure. But then, tucked into a folder labeled Strategy, Unfiled, she found a handwritten page in her father's sharp block lettering. It was titled simply, Ellie's Model. Below it were annotated diagrams of her earliest prototype. Notes she remembered submitting but never hearing back on. Her father had studied them. Improved some aspects. Flagged others. But at the bottom of the page were the words, promising. She sees things others miss. If I don't act on this, someone else will, and they'll call her a genius. Eleanor sat down slowly. The page trembled slightly in her hands. He had seen her. He just didn't know how to tell her. She returned home that night with the folder. Not for proof, not to wave it in anyone's face, but for peace. For herself. The validation no longer stung. It soothed. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the communications team. Investor engagement is up 30% since your proposal announcement. Should we prep a media interview? She smiled. This was what legacy looked like. Not statues or press releases, but real living progress. Her voice, once hidden behind the curtains of family and formality, was now the signal others followed. The company was changing. And so was she. The morning of the first company-wide town hall under Eleanor's leadership arrived with quiet anticipation. The event was scheduled in the main auditorium, where rows of folding chairs stretched across the floor like waves, all pointed toward the stage she used to sit behind, unnoticed, when her father addressed the staff. But this time, the crowd would look at her. And this time she would speak. Eleanor stood backstage, watching employees filter in, some curious, some cautious, many hopeful. It had been weeks since the board had publicly confirmed her position as the new chief executive, but this was the first time she would address everyone as the singular voice of Brenton Tech's future. She didn't feel nerves as much as clarity. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here to be honest. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the room quieted immediately. Her presence, no longer questioned or overshadowed, commanded attention. She looked across the faces. Engineers, designers, operations, marketing. People who had built their careers inside this company. People who needed to believe in its future. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but warm. "I'm Eleanor Brenton. Some of you know me as the founder's daughter. Others may have worked with me directly. But today, I speak to you as the person responsible for leading this company forward." She paused, allowing the weight of that responsibility to settle over the room. This has never been about replacing my father. It's about honoring what he built by evolving it. The world is changing fast, and we cannot afford to follow. We must lead. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. She smiled, not out of pride, but out of relief. They were with her. She continued, outlining the new initiatives, including cross-department mentorships and a diversity-driven innovation grant. Both ideas she had pushed for years ago that were now finally coming to life. Her words weren't scripted, and that authenticity resonated. She closed the meeting with a line that would be quoted in company memos for months. Legacy is not what you leave behind, it's what you build while you're here. After the town hall, the hallway outside buzzed with energy. Several long-time employees approached her, some with tears in their eyes. One older gentleman from the hardware team grasped her hand tightly and said, "Your dad never would have stood here and said what you just did. That took guts. That took vision." Later that day, Eleanor took a quiet walk through the R&D floor, observing the flow of collaboration with a kind of quiet pride. The same space where she once coded silently as a junior engineer was now her domain. But more importantly, it was a space where people felt inspired again. The culture was changing. Her culture was taking root. That evening, she returned to her apartment and found her mother waiting in the lobby. Margaret Brenton rarely visited unannounced. Eleanor raised an eyebrow but offered a warm if guarded smile. "I thought we might talk," Margaret said, holding a small paper bag. "I brought dinner." Upstairs, over takeout from Eleanor's favorite Thai place, the conversation started stiffly. Her mother asked polite questions about work, about meetings and schedules. But eventually, the formality gave way. "I watched your town hall this morning," her mother said quietly. "Your father used to rehearse those speeches for hours. He never could speak off the cuff." "I know," Eleanor replied. "I used to help him with the transitions. He never liked public speaking as much as he let on." Margaret nodded, then looked up. "He underestimated you." "We both did." It was the first time she'd admitted it aloud. Eleanor took a breath, letting the silence expand gently between them. "You didn't see what I was building. But now that you do, I'm glad." Her mother reached into her bag and pulled out a small frame. Inside was a photo of Eleanor as a child, maybe 10 years old, standing beside her father in front of the original Brenton Tech sign. Beaming, arms crossed, defiant. "You've always had that spark," Margaret said. "Even back then." Eleanor looked at the picture, a strange warmth unfolding in her chest. "I used to think I had to prove him wrong to earn my place. But maybe proving myself was never about him." Margaret nodded. "It's about you." They shared dinner without tension for the first time in years, talking not as mother and daughter bound by expectations, but as two women, both complicated, both evolving. Later that week, Eleanor received a handwritten letter forwarded to her office. The return address was unfamiliar. Inside, the paper bore the elegant script of someone who had taken their time. "Ms. Brenton, I had the honor of working under your father in the early days of Brenton Tech. He was brilliant, yes, but he was also proud, sometimes to a fault. I remember you visiting the office as a child, asking endless questions and sneaking peeks at prototype screens. We all used to joke that you'd be running the place someday. It turns out we were right. And I couldn't be more proud of that prediction. Thank you for reminding us what quiet leadership looks like. Sincerely, Harold Mooney, retired engineer, product design, 1995 to 2010 inch. Eleanor folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer in her desk, the one her father used to keep locked. She smiled to herself. She hadn't just stepped into her father's shoes. She had designed her own. In the quiet days that followed the company's transition and her family's acknowledgement, Eleanor found herself reflecting more often. Not just on what she had accomplished, but on the long winding road that brought her there. Sitting in her apartment one rainy Sunday morning, she sipped her tea and looked out across the city, the skyline glistening in soft, gray light. From this vantage point, the pain of being silenced at her father's funeral no longer felt like a wound. It had become something else entirely. A marker of the turning point that forced her voice to finally rise. She had not set out to prove anyone wrong. That had never been her mission, despite what her brother, her mother, and even some in the company had once assumed. The need to prove herself wasn't born out of spite, but out of necessity. When doors quietly close in front of you, Not with a slam but with a patronizing smile or dismissive glance. You don't rage. You build your own entrance. And that's what Eleanor had done. Not with spectacle. Not with rebellion. But with resilience, preparation, and precision. In truth, her father's will hadn't just played her voice over the funeral speakers. It had echoed through the very culture of the company he left behind. His final words didn't simply expose his regrets, they legitimized her vision. And while that validation had meant something in the moment, it wasn't what had kept her going. What kept her going were the nights when no one was watching. When she stayed late designing new protocols, reviewing code, mentoring younger staff, and assembling a strategy no one else had the foresight or patience to see. Her triumph had been forged in solitude, not applause. The moral of Eleanor's story, if there was one to be drawn, wasn't about revenge or poetic justice. It was about the quiet power of staying the course. Of believing in your own merit long before others recognize it. Too often, people wait for permission to become who they are meant to be. They wait for applause before they speak, wait for acknowledgement before they act, wait for love before they believe they're worthy. Eleanor had learned that the most defining breakthroughs happen when you move forward without any of that. When you choose to speak even when no one is listening. And yet, when they do finally listen, when the room grows silent and all eyes turn toward the person they once overlooked, there's a special kind of peace in that moment. Not because you're vindicated, but because you no longer need their approval. It becomes clear that the journey was never about earning their praise. It was about becoming undeniable. In mentoring others now, Eleanor often emphasized that lesson. You don't need a title to start acting like a leader. You don't need applause to know your value. You only need consistency, integrity, and an unshakable understanding of your own worth. She would tell the younger staff, make yourself so good they can't look away. And when they do finally see you, don't stop. That's when the real work begins. Perhaps the most beautiful shift of all happened not in the boardroom, but within her family. Her mother, who had once defended her father's dismissiveness with quiet complicity, now showed up with curiosity instead of criticism. Their relationship was still a work in progress, but it was finally being built on something real. Her brother, who had once treated her career like a footnote, had begun to respect her insights and even sought her guidance on his own ventures. And her father, though gone, had in his final act given her the very microphone he had spent years denying her. Whether out of guilt, love, or belated clarity, his decision had opened a path. Eleanor never framed her father's obituary or kept his awards on her walls. Instead, she surrounded herself with reminders of the legacy she was creating. On one shelf sat the company's new mission statement, rewritten under her leadership to emphasize inclusion, innovation, and integrity. Nearby was the thank you letter from Harold Mooney. But most precious to her was the handwritten card from an intern she had mentored that read, "Because you believed in me when no one else did, I now believe in myself." That, she realized, was the true inheritance she hoped to leave behind. Not a title, not a building with her name on it, but a ripple effect of confidence. A reminder to others that being underestimated isn't a death sentence. It's an opportunity to exceed expectations. Everyone's journey is different. Some are born into support. Others must find their footing while pushing back against the very people who should have lifted them. Eleanor's story was for the quiet ones, the observers, the dreamers, the ones who endure years of being overlooked, only to rise with such quiet force that the world has no choice but to pay attention. So what about you? Have you ever been told to sit down when you knew you were meant to stand up? Have your ideas been silenced? Your talents ignored? If so, know this, your silence today does not mean irrelevance. It is preparation. It is observation. It is gathering strength for the moment when you will be heard. And when that moment comes, because it will, step into it with grace, clarity, and conviction. Let your voice echo not in defiance, but in purpose. And remember, you don't need permission to be powerful. You already are.